annual competition for novellas for my novella, Savan Not Vani. In 2021, I won the Marguerite McGlynn annual competition for short stories for my story Uncle. My collection of short stories, including Uncle and Savan Not Vani, was called A Wild Region, and it was published in June of 2023. An essay I wrote called Different Times, Different Degrees, Same Shit appeared in the 2023 summer edition of Indiana Review. In 2024, I was named as one of 10 finalists for the Screencraft Cinematic Book Competition for Savan Not Vani. And in 2024, in August, I was a semifinalist in the James Jones First Novel Fellowship Competition. Also in 2024, I was named as an honoree in the genre category for the Indiana Authors Awards for my collection of short stories called A Wild Region. I tell you this because, not to brag, I want you to know that you don't have to have an expensive degree, although it helps, to become a writer. Hard work and a clear vision of who you want to be is what is needed. The other thing I wish to talk about is my race. Like I said, I'm an African-American mixed race writer. 30% of my ancestors came from Africa. 70% of my ancestors came out of Europe. A lot of mixed people like to get their DNA tested so we can know exactly what we're made of. That's how I know I'm 30-70. And I was raised by my white mother and my white grandmother. So I didn't have the privilege of knowing many African Americans growing up until I got to high school. So for all those little black and white kids out there, growing up in white families, and all those mixed kids growing up in America, to quote Tyrion Lannister, never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor, and it can never be used against you. And I would add to that, study your people's history so you'll know more about all sides of your ancestry. As of 2024, there were 340.5 million people in the USA. And contrary to what you see on television commercials, only 3.3% identify as mixed race. And about 11 million of those, only 3 million claim to be black and white. The number has jumped by 20% in the last decade, and the median age of mixed people in this country is 21 years old. So we're a herd of unicorns. And most of the herd are kids or new adults. Time you kids learn a little of your history. And that brings me to the first mixed race writer that I want to talk about, and that's Frank Yerby. His full name was Frank Garvin Yerby. He was born in Augusta, Georgia, on September 5th, 1916. His father, Rufus, was half black and half Seminole Indian. Rufus worked as a hotel doorman. His mother, the former Wilhelmina Ethel Smythe, was a teacher. She was mostly white, but had some distant black relatives. Frank Yerby attended the Haynes Institute, a private elementary and secondary school for black students in Augusta, and received a Bachelor of Arts in English from Payne College. He received a Master of Arts in English from Fisk University in 1938. So at first he wrote poetry, and it was published, a lot of it was published in small magazines. And then 7 years after he graduated from Fisk, his short story called Health Card won the O. Henry Memorial Award for Best First Published Short Story. The story was about a black soldier whose fellow white soldiers thought his wife was a prostitute. This award jump-started his career. In 1944, he submitted his first novel for publication, but was rejected by every publisher he contracted. His novel centered around a strong black male protagonist. He must have known the reason for rejection, because in 1944, this country was still heavy with racism. Frank Yerby then went on to write Foxes of Harrow about a strong white male protagonist, and it became a bestseller, an instant success. And Frank Yerby became the first African-American novelist to reach the bestseller list in the United States. Southern women loved his story. and many of them were appalled to find out it was written by a mixed-race African-American man. 20th Century Fox bought the screen rights to the novel, and Frank Yerby became the first African-American novelist to have a movie made out of his book by Hollywood. He was a trailblazer in many aspects. Frank Yerby went on to have a very successful career as a writer of historical fiction and pulp fiction. Someone called him the Prince of Pulp. His earlier novels, I would call, were plantation novels, and they had a very old Southern flavor. Over his entire career, he produced 33 novels and sold more than 70 million books. He was the first Black writer to make $1 million from his stories. It's another first. But he was criticized for not paying more attention to the plight of his race. To that, he answered that writers should entertain and not preach to their readers. But he showed in his novels and short stories the despicable way Black people were treated in the South. He would include searing descriptions of white slave owners and the Klan. Eventually, Frank Yerby moved to Europe to get away from the terrible racism that was prevalent at the time during the 50s and 60s. He lived in self-imposed exile in France for 3 years, and then he moved to Madrid, Spain, where he lived until he developed liver cancer, and then he had a heart attack in the hospital that he never recovered from. He died in 1991. Frank Yerby hated notoriety and even told his wife to not report his death until a year later. He wanted no one to be at his funeral except for his wife. Frank Yerby said his favorite book that he wrote was The Dahimian. That is the first book of his that I read, and I loved it. It was released in 1971, and I cannot imagine how hard the research must have been for that novel. It was about a prince of the historical kingdom of Dahomey, which existed from around 1600 to 1904. It's now southern Benin. My other favorite book of his is called A Girl from Storyville. It's about a girl who works as a prostitute in a section of New Orleans that used to be called Storyville, because in the early 20th century, a city councilman named Sidney Story got a law passed to regulate prostitution by confining it to a designated area near the French Quarter. So they named it Storyville. Frank Yerby had 4 kids, and he was married twice. Some quotes from Frank Yerby include, "I attend the Catholic Church on the rare occasions that I go to church, but I am a member of no specific sect, although I consider myself a Christian in a vague sort of way. I belong to no political party. I vote for the man and the issue regardless of the party lines. The novelist hasn't any right to inflict on the public his private ideas on politics, race, or religion." And to read a quote from the University Press of Mississippi about Frank Yerby, "The literary community cannot continue to ignore Frank Yerby and his impact on American literature. More than a fiction writer, Yerby should be put in conversation with such contemporaneous writers as Richard Wright, Dorothy West, James Baldwin, William Faulkner, Margaret Mitchell, and more." And there's a book called Rediscovering Frank Yerby. It's a collection of critical essays about Frank Yerby, and it's edited by Matthew Toch. It's part of a series called Margaret Walker Alexander's Series in African American Studies, and it's published by the University Press of Mississippi. You can order the short stories of Frank Yerby and his other books from several online retailers, including Barnes & Noble and Amazon. My research for this podcast included articles from the University Press of Mississippi website, the obituary from the New York Times and the Miami Herald, Wikipedia, and encyclopedia.com. So that includes my first podcast. I'm going to continue to look into the history of mixed people, especially writers. The next podcast that I plan to talk about Harriet Jacobs. She was a slave until she was freed. And the book that she wrote is called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It's her autobiography. Until then, keep studying your heritage. Keep writing if you're a writer. Until next time. Bye-bye.